Yo. Get the show on the road. I'm a little bit late today. Oh, yeah, by the way, congratulations, Bulldogs, 4A state champs 2021, Alabama. Put them up.
We are people who have historically been on the verge of extinction. We have been many times under much stress since being brought into this country on many slave ships. Reparations from segregation. Genius said Genesis, master system saviors. Punjabi mommy, dissect invaders on Sepulveda. Anointed players who call phrases, it's metal paper. Level layers, several shades of gray, a submission forward. MILF lover under silk covers who kiss her horses. Pilates central, the breeze serving a body temple. Jazz classics, combat and the fattest ass status. Quotient, my potion soaking like motion sickness. I overdid out my finesse back. Multi-decking new refreshment lessons from jet snacks. My mama wisdom, my competition is setbacks. Jet lagging, very swagging, my Jordans dirty. AMG performance, my foreign don't show no mercy.
Yo, greetings. Welcome to Coblow'S Daily Therapy. Reading from the book. I should change it to Rico's Daily Reading Teaching, but it's Rico's Daily Therapy. Reading from the book. Medical Apartheid, the Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present by Harriet A. Watkins. I repeat once again, Medical Apartheid, the Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present by Harriet A. Watkins. And y'all might be surprised and think that's a black woman that wrote this book, but according to the look of it, the back of the book, she might be black, she might be white. Might be like a little Rachel Dolezal, I don't know. But either way it goes, she's dropping a lot of true facts, a lot of valuable information that we should be aware of and that we should pay attention to because we don't want history to repeat itself. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm on part 1 of this book. Part 1 is called A Troubling Tradition, and I'm in chapter 2. And chapter 2 is entitled Profitable Wonders. Antebellum Medical Experimentation with Slaves and Freedmen. Now I'm on the second passage today. I might be on the third passage, but this is my second day reading this chapter. This passage is entitled Politics in the Laboratory. Although experimentation with African Americans was the medical norm, especially in the South, some whites were deeply opposed to it. In the late 18th century, or 18th and early 19th centuries, abolitionists wrote exposés, and in 1839, Theodore Wright Wells uncovered the cruelty of medical experimentation in American slavery, as it is, declaring public opinion would tolerate surgical experiments, operations, and processes performed upon slaves, which it would execrate if performed upon their masters. Such pointed criticism may help to explain why some physician scientists who spoke candidly of injecting, dosing, or performing revolutionary surgeries on their slave patients in the first half of the 19th century expressed their actions more guardedly in later writings. For example, Dr. James Marion Sims, the one that got all the statues in Alabama at the Capitol and in Virginia at the Capitol and South Carolina, Dr. James Sims, Marion Sims, eventually hid his subjects, race, and even illustrated reports of experiments on black slave women with illustrations of bourgeois white matrons. Journals sometimes dispense with racial labels, although their articles still offer broad social cues about their subject's ethnicity. So they might have said ghetto, downtrodden, poor, dark, and certain keywords they use to let you know they were black. Like they do now when they say thug, they want you to think that it's black. Language was often tortured to disguise the racial nature of hazardous experimentation. In the best patrician tradition of his times, Thomas Jefferson was not only a country squire and leading politician, but also a scientist. Eager to make his mark, Jefferson embarked on enthusiastic adventures in vaccination by gambling with the lives of his slaves. He wished to establish that Edward Jenner's new technique of victimization of vaccination was superior to the technique of inoculation, or as it came to be called a century later, variolation. Inoculation consisted of inserting or injecting infected material from a sick person directly into a well one to induce immunity. Vaccination in this era referred to the process of injecting cowpox to provide immunity to smallpox, as Jenner first described in 1796. Jefferson obtained some some cowpox vaccine indirectly from Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse of Boston, but it was known to be of dubious potency. The vaccine had failed to protect the subjects of an earlier trial. Jefferson spent that summer vaccinating 200 of his family's and his neighbors' slaves. Only after they escaped illness did Jefferson inject his white family in Monticello. Monticello, I think it's okay. Yeah, I don't know. That name sounds more familiar now. The vaccinated persons remained well, and the unvaccinated ones fell ill. But this did not convince Jefferson's scientific peers. So Jefferson had a vaccinated slave injected with live smallpox material. Torturers, ain't that something? Barbaric, inhumane. When this slave remained well, Jefferson wrote his daughter Martha to proceed in order to, quote, place our families and neighbors in perfect security, end quote. As a seasoned politician, Jefferson knew that his experiments on slaves would be criticized and that they seemed at variance with his sympathetic statements about blacks. So he slyly used language to deflect possible criticism, referring to conducting experiments on some of my own family, without clarifying that the family in question consisted of slaves owned by himself and his son, and probably impregnated by his father. Maybe his father did the same thing that he did. And so he had brothers and sisters, not only mixed kids, but maybe he had mixed siblings. And that's all. An epidemic of typhoid fever raged in Virginia throughout the summer of 1832, and planters feared that the infected slaves would be unable to work and would endanger whites. Dr. Robert G. Jennings had no cure, but he decided to test the hunch that smallpox vaccine might protest against typhoid. He administered the vaccine to 30 blacks, slaves, and free, choosing them from uninfected family members of typhoid patients in order to guarantee they would be exposed. He then withheld the vaccine from other uninfected family members. Jennings reported that those who were vaccinated remained disease-free. The unvaccinated became ill. When Jennings then vaccinated blacks suffering from typhoid, he jubilantly recorded that they recovered more quickly. Jennings delivered the investigative coup de grace when he decided to vaccinate 11 of 12 family members, withholding vaccine from the 12th. Only the unvaccinated slave fell ill. This successful experiment on an enslaved population defies all logic because smallpox vaccine is not efficacious against typhoid. One cannot be certain whether serendipity or outright fraud was involved, but the mathematical odds against such results arising by luck are staggering, and no one has ever successfully duplicated Jennings' experiment. Many other experiments on slaves accrued no benefit to the black subject, and white patients were not asked and certainly were not forced to assume these risks. The next decade saw an escalation of sadism and experiments on slaves. The 1846 records of Dr. Walter E. Johns of Petersburg, Virginia, revealed that he experimented by pouring boiling water on naked enslaved typhoid pneumonia patients at 4-hour intervals. Boiling water. He described one such treatment on a sick 25-year-old enslaved man. The patient was placed on the floor on his face, and about 5 gallons of water at a temperature of near the boiling point, as to barely allow immersion of the hand, was thrown immediately on the spinal column, which seemed to arouse his sensibility somewhat, as shown by an effort to cry out. He tried to cry in pain. Jones didn't reveal what had inspired him to try this remedy, and he offered a rather thin rationale for the treatment, suggesting only that it worked by somehow reestablishing the capillary circulation, end quote. Circulating the blood by, I guess, the adrenaline pumping through his veins from pain. In June of the same year, John M.B. Harden, M.D. of Liberty County, Georgia, published an article in the Southern Medical and Surgical Journal that described how he had stripped blood vessels from the limbs of a quote, a Negro and of, quote, 3 hogs, end quote. Harden then measured the width of the blood vessels to determine the relative areas of the trunks and branches of arteries, with the stated intent of furthering anatomical knowledge. But none of these increasingly painful medical intrusions was as infamous as the slave experimentation conducted by James Marion Sims, M.D. of Alabama. Once again, that word Alabama coming up in atrocious behavior by slave masters. So now let's talk about this guy. I got a picture of him, and I put it up on Facebook one day when I went down to Montgomery to see my homeboy Pooh, Alice People. We went to the Capitol, and I took a picture of the statue that they have of James Marion Sims. And like I said, I also know that they got one of them in New York, and I think they got one of them in Virginia. I mean, he was a nationwide sadist doctor. James Marion Sims, savior and sadist. James Marion Sims is an important figure in the history of experimentation with African Americans because he so well embodies the dual face of American medicine, to which racial health disparities owe so much. Sims is revered as a women's benefactor, although he conducted years of nightmarishly painful and degrading experiments without anesthesia or consent on a group of slave women. He was born into a struggling family of 10 in Hanging Rock, near Lawrenceville, South Carolina in 1813. In his autobiography, The Story of My Life, Sims described how, despite a career as an indifferent, mediocre student, he gained entrance first to South Carolina Medical College and then to Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. In the matter of the day, his medical education consisted of a year and a half of instruction. Sims confessed that he initially found his medical training wanting. Quote, when it came time to making up a prescription, I had no more idea of what to do than if I had never studied medicine. That means he wasn't even interested in going to school for medicine. He only went because his family had money and it was expected of him to do something of quality or standard. So he chose being a doctor, an MD. But once he embarked upon practice on the plantations of Alabama, these feelings of inadequacy did not prevent him from blaming enslaved mothers for the high death rates of their infant children. That was because he had authority. He went to school and got certified as an MD. He ascribed neonatal tetanus, newborn tetanus, or trismus nascentium to the mother's moral and intellectual failures. Whenever there are poverty and filth and laziness, you know they threw that laziness in there, or where the intellectual capacity is cramped, the moral and social feelings blunted, there it will be oftener found. Wealth, a cultivated intellect, a refined mind, and affectionate heart are comparatively exempt from the ravages of this unmercifully fatal malady, but expose this class to the same physical causes, and they become equal sufferers with the first. Talking about black people. Neonatal tetanus is caused by a bacterial infection with Clostridium tetani, which emanates from animal manure and thrives in wounds such as healing umbilical stumps. Thus, Sims perceived the connection between filth and illness, which was not yet an accepted medical belief, but he blamed the wrong parties. Owners built slave shacks on inferior lands near horse stables and other quarters, and as far as possible from the whites' dwellings. Antebellum doctors' disdain for hand washing, as well as the midwifery practice of swaddling the umbilical cord with rags, raised the risk of infection. But by attributing tetanus to the laziness and weakness of slaves, he deflected attention from the simplest way of removing contagion, relocating and improving slave dwellings. Today, we know the deaths were probably the caregiver's fault. As a plantation doctor, Sims attended many children, but he used only the black infants as subjects for dangerous experiments in tetany, a long misunderstood children's neuromuscular disease characterized by convulsions and muscle spasms. Tetany that was epidemic among enslaved children was actually the result of severe calcium, magnesium, and vitamin D deficiency caused by chronic malnutrition. But Sims was erroneously convinced that it was caused by the displacement of skull bones during birth. He took a sick black baby from his mother, made incisions in his scalp, then wielded a cobbler's tool to pry the skull bone into new positions. Quote, during this time, I would occasionally puncture the scalp over the lumboidal suture with the point of a crooked awl and prise out the edges of the parietal bones always, with the effect of greatly modifying the rigid floor of the extremities. End quote. Sims' attempt to open the skull was based upon a scientific myth that the bones of a black infant's skulls, unlike white infants, grow together quickly, leaving the brain no space to grow and develop. So that's why they say that we lack the brain activity that they had, that we lack intellectualism because our skull was too small or whatever, a bunch of jive. So let's get back on this. This premature closing of the black skull was held to cause low intelligence and perpetual childishness in adult blacks. When the infants died, Sims castigated the sloth and ignorance of their mothers and the black midwives who attended them. Sims soon acquired 17 slaves whom he used in his experiments and as workers in his clinic/laboratory, better known as a laboratory. The first 3 such patients fared miserably under Sims' faltering scalpel. One 19-year-old enslaved man died after 2 heroic operations, including the unanesthetized removal of bone segments, presumably to prevent the spread of an infection. Sims' account of the surgeries glossed over the patient's death to dwell upon technical details of greater interest to his medical readers. Mistakes such as a patient's near suffocation from a sponge that Sims forgot to remove from his mouth after removing part of his cancerous jaw, and Sims' failure to stanch a patient's bleeding from the carotid artery were also given short shrift. But these were mere prelude. On a June day in 1845, 17-year-old Anarcha, a slave on the West Off plantation just outside of Montgomery, Alabama, felt the contractions that heralded the birth of her first child. 3 days later, the exhausted, terrified girl still writhed in excruciating labor. Sims was called in and used obstetrical forceps, with which he admitted he had little experience. The child died, and although Anarcha seemed out of out of immediate danger, she soon faced another horrible trial. Her torn vagina began eroding, and she was left with openings between the remains of her vagina and her bladder and rectum. She was now incontinent, and the incessantly flowing urine inflamed her ravaged tissues, triggering pain, recurring infections, and odor. So he tore up her private parts. I think there's some ravaged her private parts and made it to where she had incontinence. She couldn't hold her piss. She had it just ran out. She couldn't clench it. She didn't even know when she probably had to use the bathroom. As terrible as that narco's condition was, a certain hyperbole entered Sims' descriptions of it. He compared it to smallpox and stressed its unpleasantness for spectators, as well as the fact that it made her unfit for work, a planter's perspective. Anarcha was far from alone in her misery. Her condition, vesicovaginal, fistula, afflicted many women, black and white, who survived clitoral childbirth. No, difficult childbirth. What am I saying? However, enslaved women had an especially high rates of this complication. Despite physicians' tendency to blame the ignorance and obtrusive interference of our plantation accountancy, accoucheurs, and nigger midwives, Sims himself conceded that the rates of vesicovaginal fistula had risen when obstetricians began using forceps, probably tainted forceps. The condition may well have been due to a confluence of malnutrition, forceps use, and Anarcha's youth. The vitamin D deficiency that was very common among malnourished slave women caused home defects or bone defects, including a small pelvis. This made birth difficult, especially in the underdeveloped pelvises of very young women. And slave women became mothers approximately 3 years earlier than did white women. Vesicovaginal fistula is emotionally and socially invalidism. Sims knew that curing it would make his medical fortune, and he also knew that using white women to test such painful surgeries as might be effective against it was impossible. Historian Walter Fisher sums it up. It is most improbable that Sims and the assistant, Bozeman, could have established a remarkable surgical schedule without the slave system, which provided the experimental subjects. Slaves did not have to be recruited, persuaded, and cajoled to endure pain and indignity. They could not refuse. Sims acquired a total of 11 women slaves in vesicovaginal fistula from their masters by promising to lodge, board, and treat them. And he built a Spartan wooden building where he conducted surgical experiments on them for the next 4 years. During the Victorian period, layers of dress signaled sexual chastity, and doctors were not in the habit of viewing women's unclothed bodies. Not even their professional stature gave them license to gaze at women's genitalia. When Sims undertook his fistula experiments, even the term gynecology was a few years in the future. Instead, quote, women's doctors averted their eyes in a chivalrous fashion as they knelt to tend to the modestly clothed ladies of their class, relying upon their sense of touch beneath voluminous Victorian skirts. That means they turn their head and try to check a woman out to try to keep respect for her femininity and her nudity, her privacy. However, Sims, working with enslaved blacks, was constrained by no such delicacy. He made the women undress completely, then kneel on hands and knees while he and several physicians took turns inserting a special speculum he had devised to open the women's vaginas fully to view. I saw everything as no man had seen before, marveled Sims. Montgomery physicians flocked to Sims' shack to see what no man had seen before, so did prominent citizens and local apprentices. And that's what sadomasochism comes in. That's where the sickness of sadomasochism and torture comes in, that using surgical instruments as sexual instruments. That's where that comes in. There. I'm gonna go on and knock this out. Let me see how much I got left. I got to the next passage out. The surgeries themselves were terribly painful. Not only had Sims to close the unnatural openings in the ravaged vaginal tissues, he had to make the edges of these openings knit together. He opted to abrade or scarcity the edges of the vaginal tears every time he attempted to repair it and open it. He then closed them with sutures and saw them become infected and reopened painfully every time. Several male doctors had initially assisted Sims by holding down the enslaved women as he made incisions, but within a year, they could bear neither the bone-chilling shrieks of the women nor the lack of progress any longer. The doctors left, leaving the women to take turns restraining one another. Later, Sims recruited Dr. Nathan Bozeman as a protege and assistant. Bozeman was a recent medical graduate of the University of Louisville and had trained with some of the best surgeons in the region, such as Professor Samuel D. Gross. Hey, Pooh, I'm reading that about that man I took that picture of down at the Capitol in Montgomery, that Sims dude that tortured out on black women, that medical guy. Medical journals and professional word of mouth had detailed the inhalation of ether and as anesthesia since the early 1840s. And Sims knew of this, but he flatly refused to administer anesthesia to the slave women and girls. He claimed that this procedure were, quote, not painful enough to justify the trouble and risk attending the administration, end quote. But this claim rings hollow when one learns that Sims always administered anesthesia when he performed the perfected surgery to repair the vaginas of white women in Montgomery a few years later. Sims also cited the popular belief that blacks did not feel pain in the same way as whites. However, ain't that something? However, Sims' own words belie him. In his own memoirs, he noted that Lucy's agony was extreme. She was much prostrated, and I thought she was going to die, end quote. Sims further obscured the truth in 1852 when he described the first surgery on Lucy, writing, quote, that was before the days of anesthetics, and the poor girl on her knees bore the operation with great heroism and bravery, end quote. Ain't that something? Denied her anesthesia. Lucy. Sims' refusal to administer ether seems even less defensible in light of his willingness to administer it very freely to another group of women without apparent regard for its trouble and risk. In New York during the 1860s, Sims attended white women patients who suffered from vaginismus. I ain't never heard of that. White women that suffer from vaginismus, a disorder marked by painful vaginal muscle contractions that prevent the entrance of the penis, making intercourse impossible. Complaining husbands approached Sims, who regularly etherized their wives, rendering them unconscious so that their husbands could have sex with them. Rape. Knocking them out. Ain't that some date rape way back then? Give your wife this and they'll knock out and then you can screw her. That way she don't feel the pain. Sims' writings often utilize imprisonment as a metaphor for the control that he saw as a key to restoring a woman's health. His enslaved experimental subjects were the ultimate and controllable patients, and he eventually chose to control his slaves' pain in a peculiar manner. He addicted the slave women to morphine, but he gave it to them, quote, some form of opium in as large doses as can be borne, at least twice in 24 hours, end quote. Only after surgery, not before surgery, after. Administering it for several weeks each time. Sims explained that opium, quote, calms the nerves, inspires hope, relieves the scalding of the urine, and permitted the patient doomed to a fortnight's horizontal position to pass the time with pleasant dreams and delightful sensations instead of painful forebodings and intolerable suffering. That's because they doped up. They way geeked up, way high on morphine. Ain't that something? Let me scoop this up some. I don't know what's going on. I can't get my eyes right today. Okay, where was I? The morphine did ease recovery, but it did not allay the pain of the procedures itself. So this practice perplexed some of Sims' contemporaries. The most logical explanation is that this practice had more to do with controlling the women's behavior than controlling their pain, because the addiction weakened their will to resist repeated procedures. As mentioned earlier, the medical sensation between assiduous cleanliness and infection had not yet been drawn. And although Sims was a man of scrupulously clean surgical habits, the constant exposure of the organic sutures to pathogens caused women repeated infections. Sims, however, had a serendipitous inspiration. He decided to devise sutures of silver. Silver did not harbor pathogens, and the infections were finally tamed, allowing the possibility of healing. In the end, Sims triumphantly recorded closing Anarchist's largest fingertip-sized fistula. He announced that he had perfected the vesico-vaginal fistula operation in May of 1849 after scores of operations over 5 years, more than 30 operations on Anarchists alone. In 1852, Sims' paper on vesico-vaginal fistula repair was published in the prestigious American Journal of the Medical Sciences. It made his national reputation. Sims became the celebrated, quote, father of American gynecology, and as such his place in history was assured. W.J.S. McKay, M.D., spoke for his fellow surgeons in predicting that, quote, when the history of modern gynecology is written, the work that Dr. Ephraim McDowell did will be represented as the dawn, and the first bright planet that appeared in the dim light of that dawn was Marion Sims. In the early 1850s, bouts with malaria forced Sims north to New York City, where he became a medical lion who built a society practice, did research with blacks and immigrant women, taught medicine, and held many influential positions in hospitals, medical societies, and in academia. Now, he left Alabama and went to New York. That don't say a whole lot good for New York, though. Where am I? Academia. He founded the New York Women's Hospital, the first hospital for women, which was built at Park Avenue and 15th Street or 50th Street, the present site of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Beginning in 1862, he also sojourned abroad, where his medical fame gave him entry into royal circles. He and his family became the toast of Second Empire Paris, while Sims attended the Empress Eugenie and other members of the French royal family. Across 2 continents, monuments, memorials, and clinics sprang up in his wake, including the one that now stands in New York Central Park, all celebrating his stature as a physician, treating alike empress and slave. He was a sadist, sadomasochist. Sims wrote copiously about his work and medical philosophies, as well as his life in Alabama. Sims' vigorous defense of the slavery system had been liberally seasoned with, quote, nigger. However, once up north, he hid the ethnicity of his subjects, portraying them as white in the illustrations that accompany his accounts of the surgery. His duplicitous praise of the indomitable courage of these long-suffering women failed to mention that it was chattel slavery and morphine, not courage, that had bound the women to his surgical table. Sims never disclosed whether he closed the fistulae of his other slave patients, although many who have written about him seem to take it as a matter of course that he did so. However, his erstwhile colleague, Bozeman, insisted that not one half of the slave women they worked upon together were affected or afforded relief by the years of painful service. That means his assistant said that they didn't repair the damage they done to the other slave, but they went and repaired other women. Ain't that something? Bozeman reported correctly some of the remaining fistulae himself, using a surgical innovation of, quote, button sutures, a technique he perfected by performing the procedure on other black slave women, Kitty, Donna, and an unnamed mulatto girl. Bozeman even described a case of viscovaginal fistula created by Sims when he removed the bladder stones of a 9-year-old slave girl. 9 years old. Sims was not pleased and used the New York Academy of Medicine as a bullet pulpit to attack Bozeman for appropriating his technique. But Bozeman was not the only challenger to Sims' primacy as inventor of viscovaginal fistula repair. In 1838, 15 years before Sims took up the problem, Virginia surgeon John Peter Mettauer had devised a similar procedure using lead rather than silver suture. Mettauer had operated on 25 women in Prince Edward County, Virginia, a large slaveholding area, but cured only one woman. Mettauer blamed the slave women for his inability to help them. Speaking of one, he claimed, I believe this case nevertheless could have been cured in the process of time, especially if sexual intercourse could have been prevented, which intercourse, I have no doubt, defeated several of the operations, end quote. And that's it for today's couple of passages. Tomorrow I'll start up on Antebellum Ethica. These are some long passages, and I don't know why I couldn't get my lighting right today. I tried, but I could not get the lighting right today. But I still got it done. I tried. So I'm out of here, y'all. It's Coco, baby. You know what they said first. Let me thank y'all for tuning in. Thank y'all. I seen a couple of y'all tuning in. I want y'all to share this if you can. But thank you for tuning in. You know what they say? You want to keep something from a black man, put it in a book. Well, you know what I've been saying. I go get that book and get that information and bring what they've been trying to keep from you to you. I deliver it to your front doorstep like it's a Domino's pizza. I'll bring it to you. Just like Pizza Hut deliver now, I'm delivering now. I'm the new delivery man. Call me DoorDash. But I'm delivering information and water. You see, guys, I look at this information just like it's water. We need water to survive. We need water to live. If we don't have water, we'll die. If we don't have oxygen or water, we'll die. We need that to survive. So I'll go get it and I'll bring it to you. And then I'll also come and get you and I'll lead you to this way right here. I'll leave the horse and the cow to water, but I can't make them drink. Don't be that horse or that cow. Be a bull. Come get it. Be greedy. Eat it up. Be a pig. Be a hog. I'm out of here, y'all. It's Coco, baby. Coblow'S. I'm God's baby. Peace.